The morning sun was just starting to peek through the clouds when 17-year-old David Johnson walked through the gates of Henderson Aviation. His worn sneakers made soft sounds on the concrete as he headed toward the maintenance hangar. Most kids his age were probably still sleeping, but David had been getting up at 6 in the morning for the past 8 months to work at this small aircraft repair shop near the city airport. David wasn't your typical teenager. While his friends spent their free time playing video games or hanging out at the mall, he preferred to be elbow-deep in engines, figuring out how things worked. His fascination with machines started when he was just 10 years old, watching his neighbor fix an old motorcycle in the garage. Something about the way all those parts came together to create power and movement just made sense to him. The aircraft maintenance facility wasn't much to look at from the outside. It was a simple metal building with big doors that opened to reveal a workspace filled with tools, spare parts, and usually 1 or 2 small planes getting repaired. Mr. Henderson, the owner, was a quiet man in his 60s who had been fixing aircraft for over 30 years. When David first showed up asking for a job, Henderson wasn't sure about hiring someone so young. But after watching David work for just one afternoon, he knew the kid had something special. "Morning, David," called out Tony, one of the senior mechanics, as David hung up his jacket. Tony had been working on aircraft since before David was born, and he had taken the young man under his wing. "We got that Cessna 172 that needs its engine looked at, and there's a Piper with radio problems." David nodded and grabbed his toolbox. It was a simple metal box that had belonged to his grandfather, filled with basic tools that he had slowly upgraded over the months. He had learned early on that good tools made all the difference, but more importantly, knowing how to use them properly was what really mattered. As he worked on the Cessna's engine, David's mind was completely focused. He had taught himself to read engine manuals by checking them out from the public library. When he couldn't find what he needed there, he would spend hours watching repair videos online, taking notes in a small notebook that he always kept in his back pocket. His grandmother often joked that he treated that notebook like it was full of secret treasure maps. The truth was, David's family didn't have much money. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and pay rent for their small apartment. His father had left when David was 12, and since then it had been just David, his mother, and his grandmother living together. The part-time job at Henderson Aviation didn't pay a lot, but every dollar helped, and more importantly, David was doing something he truly loved. Around 10 in the morning, the usual quiet of the hangar was interrupted by the sound of expensive car engines pulling up outside. David looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning to see 3 black SUVs parked near the entrance. Men in dark suits got out and started looking around, checking the area like they were expecting trouble. "What's all that about?" David asked Tony, who was wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. "Rich guy with a private jet," Tony explained. "His plane's been giving us trouble for 2 days now. We can't figure out what's wrong with it, and he's getting pretty upset about the delay." Through the hangar doors, David could see the aircraft in question. It was a beautiful Gulfstream G550, the kind of plane that cost more money than most people would see in their entire lives. The white paint gleamed in the sunlight, and David could see the expensive leather seats through the windows. "What kind of problem is it having?" David asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Tony shrugged. "Electrical issue. The navigation system keeps shutting down randomly. We've checked all the obvious stuff, replaced some fuses, tested the main power systems. Everything looks fine on paper, but the problem keeps coming back." David set down his tools and walked over to get a better look at the Gulfstream. He had never worked on anything this expensive or complex before, but aircraft electrical systems followed the same basic principles, whether it was a small Cessna or a multi-million-dollar jet. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Tony glanced around, nervously. "I don't know, kid. This isn't some weekend warrior's Piper. If we mess something up on this thing, Mr. Henderson could lose his business license." But Mr. Henderson himself had overheard the conversation. He walked over, looking tired and frustrated. "At this point, I'm willing to try anything," he said. "We've got our 3 best mechanics stumped, and the owner is threatening to take his business elsewhere and maybe file a complaint with the aviation authority. David felt his heart racing with excitement and nervousness. This was way beyond anything he had worked on before, but something inside him wanted to try. He had always been good at seeing patterns that others missed, at finding problems hiding in places where no one thought to look. "Just let me study the wiring diagrams for a few minutes," David said. "I won't touch anything without asking first." Mr. Henderson nodded and handed him a thick manual. David found a quiet corner and started reading, his finger tracing the complex electrical pathways that powered the aircraft systems. The navigation equipment was connected to the main electrical bus through a series of relays and circuit breakers. On paper, everything looked straightforward, but David knew that real-world problems were often more complicated than what the diagram showed. After studying for about an hour, David had an idea. He had noticed something in the wiring diagram that didn't quite make sense. There was a backup relay for the navigation system that was located in a spot that would be very difficult to reach and inspect. Most mechanics would probably assume it was working fine since it was so hard to get to. "Mr. Henderson," David called out, "I think I might know where to look." The older man came over, followed by Tony and the other mechanics. David explained his theory about the backup relay, pointing to the location on the diagram. "That relay is buried pretty deep in the avionics bay," Tony said, shaking his head. "We'd have to remove a lot of other equipment just to get to it." "But think about it," David continued, his excitement growing. "If that relay is corroded or has a loose connection, it would cause exactly the kind of random shutdowns you're describing. The main system would work fine most of the time, but when the aircraft hits turbulence or changes altitude, the vibration could cause the bad connection to act up." Mr. Henderson looked at the young man with new respect. "That's actually pretty smart thinking," he admitted. "Most people would focus on the main systems and never think to check the backup components." "It's worth a try," Tony agreed. "We're running out of other options anyway." Getting to the suspect relay required removing several panels and carefully moving some expensive equipment out of the way. David worked slowly and methodically, making sure to document exactly how everything was connected so it could be put back together properly. His hands were steady despite his nervousness, and he found himself falling into the same focused state that always came over him when he was working on a challenging problem. When he finally reached the backup relay, David's heart jumped. The metal connections were green with corrosion, and one of the wires had worked loose from its terminal. It was exactly the kind of problem that would cause intermittent failures that were hard to diagnose. "Found it?" he called out, his voice echoing from inside the avionics bay. The other mechanics crowded around to see what he had discovered. Even they had to admit that the corroded relay was definitely the source of the problem. David carefully cleaned the connections, replaced the faulty relay with a new one from the shop's inventory, and double-checked all the wire connections. Putting everything back together took another hour, but finally, the aircraft was ready for testing. Mr. Henderson started up the navigation system and ran it through several test cycles. Everything worked perfectly, with no signs of the random shutdowns that had been plaguing the aircraft. "I'll be darned," Tony said, shaking his head in amazement. "The kid figured out in 2 hours what we couldn't solve in 2 days. David felt a surge of pride, but he tried not to let it go to his head. He had been lucky to spot something that others had missed, but he also knew that his methodical approach and willingness to think outside the box had made the difference. Just as they were finishing up the paperwork, another black SUV pulled up outside the hangar. This time, only one man got out. He was tall and well-dressed, probably in his 50s, with the kind of confident walk that suggested he was used to being in charge. David could tell immediately that this was the owner of the Gulfstream. The man walked into the hangar and looked around until his eyes settled on Mr. Henderson. "I'm Jonathan Blackstone," he said in a firm voice. "I understand my aircraft is finally ready?" Mr. Henderson nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We found the problem and fixed it. Should be good as new now." "I certainly hope so," Blackstone replied. "This delay has already cost me an important business meeting in London. I need to know that this problem won't happen again." David watched from a distance as Mr. Henderson explained the technical details of the repair. He could see that Blackstone was listening carefully, asking intelligent questions that showed he understood aircraft systems better than most people. When Mr. Henderson mentioned that it was actually David who had identified and fixed the problem, Blackstone's eyebrows went up with surprise. He looked around the hangar until he spotted David, who was trying to clean the grease from under his fingernails. "You're telling me that a teenager solved a problem that stumped your experienced mechanics?" Blackstone asked, his voice carrying a mix of skepticism and curiosity. David felt his cheeks getting warm as all eyes turned toward him. This wasn't the kind of attention he was used to, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. "Yes, sir," Mr. Henderson said proudly. "David has a real gift for this kind of work. He sees things that other people miss." Blackstone walked over to where David was standing. Up close, the businessman was even more intimidating, but David forced himself to make eye contact and stand up straight. "Explain to me what was wrong with my aircraft," Blackstone said. It wasn't really a request. David took a deep breath and started explaining about the backup relay, the corrosion, and how the intermittent connection was causing the navigation system to shut down randomly. As he talked, he could see that Blackstone was following every detail, nodding at the technical explanations and asking follow-up questions that showed he really understood what David was saying. "And you figured this out, how exactly?" Blackstone asked when David finished. "Well, sir, I just looked at the wiring diagrams and tried to think about what could cause the kind of problem you were having. Most people focus on the main systems, but sometimes the issue is with something that's supposed to be a backup or secondary component." Blackstone studied David for a long moment, and David could feel himself being evaluated in some way he didn't quite understand. There was something in the older man's eyes that seemed familiar, though David couldn't figure out why. "How old are you?" Blackstone asked. 17, sir. "And you learned aircraft repair where exactly?" David felt a little embarrassed. "Mostly from books and videos, sir, and working here with Mr. Henderson and the other mechanics. No formal training?" "No, sir. Can't afford trade school right now." Blackstone nodded slowly, still studying David with that intense gaze. There was definitely something going on behind those eyes, some kind of calculation or decision being made. "Well," Blackstone said finally, "I have to admit that I'm impressed. Not many people your age would have the patience or the insight to solve a problem like that." David felt a mix of pride and relief. "Thank you, sir." As Blackstone prepared to leave, David turned back to his workbench to clean up his tools. The excitement of successfully repairing such an expensive aircraft was starting to wear off, and he was looking forward to getting back to the familiar routine of working on smaller planes. But something made him look up, just as Blackstone was walking toward the hangar door. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows at just the right angle, and it caught the chain around David's neck, making the metal pendant hanging from it gleam in the light. David didn't notice, but Blackstone suddenly stopped walking. The businessman turned around slowly, his face going completely white as he stared at David's necklace. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. David was busy organizing his tools and didn't realize that anything unusual was happening. He absently reached up to adjust the chain around his neck, a habit he had developed over the years. The pendant shifted slightly, catching even more of the afternoon sunlight. From across the hangar, Blackstone's hands began to tremble slightly. He took a step closer, then another, his eyes fixed on the necklace that David wore. The young mechanic still hadn't noticed the attention, focused as he was on putting away his equipment. "Excuse me," Blackstone called out, his voice sounding strange and strained. David looked up, surprised to see that the businessman was still there and appeared to be staring directly at him. "Yes, sir?" Blackstone moved closer, his eyes never leaving David's necklace. "That pendant you're wearing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get it?" David looked down at his chest, confused by the businessman's intense stare. The chain around his neck held a small metal pendant that he wore every single day. It was nothing fancy, just a pair of old pilot wings that had belonged to his grandfather. Most people never even noticed it under his work shirt. "This?" David asked, touching the pendant with his fingers. "It belonged to my grandfather." Blackstone's face went even whiter, if that was possible. He took another step closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor of the hangar. David could see that the man's hands were actually shaking now, and his breathing seemed different, like he was having trouble getting enough air. Could I see it more closely? Blackstone asked, his voice sounding strange and tight. David felt uncomfortable. He had never taken the necklace off in front of anyone except his grandmother, and this man was basically a stranger. But there was something in Blackstone's eyes that made David think this wasn't just casual curiosity. The businessman looked like he had seen a ghost. I guess so, David said slowly. He reached behind his neck and unclasped the chain, then held it out so Blackstone could get a better look at the pilot wings. Blackstone's hands were trembling so much that David wasn't sure the man could even hold the necklace safely. Instead, David kept hold of the chain but moved closer so Blackstone could examine the wings more carefully. The pilot wings were made of gold-colored metal, though David had never been sure if they were real gold or just gold-plated. They were small and delicate, with detailed engravings that showed they were definitely military issue. The wings had a shield in the center with an eagle, and there were tiny letters and numbers that David had never really paid attention to. But Blackstone was studying every detail like his life depended on it. He leaned in closer and David could see that the man's eyes were getting watery. "Turn it over," Blackstone whispered. "Please, turn it over." David flipped the pendant over to show the back. There was some writing engraved there, but it was small, and David had never been able to read it clearly. He had always assumed it was just his grandfather's name or maybe his military unit. When Blackstone saw the writing on the back, he made a sound like someone had punched him in the stomach. He actually stumbled backward a step, and for a moment David thought the man might fall down. "Are you okay, sir?" David asked, genuinely worried now. Blackstone couldn't seem to speak. He just stood there staring at the pendant, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. Mr. Henderson had noticed what was happening and came over to see if there was a problem. "Everything all right here?" he asked, looking back and forth between David and the obviously upset businessman. "I think he's sick or something," David said. "He asked to see my necklace and then he got all weird." Tony and the other mechanics had stopped their work and were watching the strange scene unfold. It wasn't every day that a millionaire businessman showed up at their shop, and it definitely wasn't normal for someone to have this kind of reaction to a piece of jewelry. Blackstone finally managed to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What was your grandfather's name?" David was getting more confused by the minute. "Captain Samuel Williams. He died when I was little." "Why?" The moment David said the name, Blackstone's knees actually buckled. He had to grab onto the workbench to keep from falling down completely. His face had gone from white to gray, and David was starting to think they might need to call an ambulance. "Samuel Williams," Blackstone repeated, like he was testing the words to make sure he had heard them correctly. "Captain Samuel Williams." "Yeah, that's right," David said. "Did you know him or something?" Blackstone looked up at David with tears now clearly visible in his eyes. "Know him?" he said, his voice cracking. "He was my best friend. He saved my life more times than I can count." The hangar went completely quiet. Even the sound of tools and equipment seemed to stop as everyone tried to process what they had just heard. "That's impossible," David said. "My grandfather died in a plane crash 30 years ago. He was in the military." "I know," Blackstone said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I was there. We were flying together on a mission when his plane went down. I've been living with the guilt of not being able to save him for 3 decades. David felt like the world had suddenly tilted sideways. This successful businessman had known his grandfather, had been there when he died. It seemed too incredible to be true. "I don't understand," David said. "How do you know it's really the same person?" Blackstone pointed to the pendant with a shaking finger. "Because I gave him those wings, and I wrote the message on the back myself." David looked down at the engraving that he had never been able to read clearly. "What does it say?" "To Sam, fly safe, return home, JB." Blackstone recited the words from memory. "Jonathan Blackstone, my initials." David's mind was spinning. He had worn this necklace every day for years, never knowing that it connected him to someone who was still alive, someone who had known and cared about his grandfather. "Tell me about him," Blackstone said urgently. "Tell me about your family. Samuel always talked about having a son back home, but when I tried to find his family after the war, I couldn't locate anyone." David's thoughts were jumbled, but he tried to answer. "My grandfather had my dad when he was really young before he joined the military. My dad never talked about him much, said he barely knew him because he was always away on missions." Blackstone nodded. "That sounds right. Samuel was dedicated to his service, but he talked about his son all the time. He carried a picture of a little boy in his wallet. He was going to teach him to fly when he got home from the war." "My dad?" David asked. "Your father," Blackstone confirmed. "Samuel had big plans. He wanted to start a small aviation business, maybe give flying lessons. He said his son was going to be his first student." David felt a strange mix of sadness and curiosity. He had never known any of this about his grandfather. His father had never mentioned that his dad wanted to teach him to fly, or that he had dreams of working in aviation. "What happened to my dad after that?" David asked. "I mean, after my grandfather died?" "I don't know," Blackstone admitted. "Like I said, I tried to find Samuel's family, but I didn't have much information to go on. The military records showed next of kin, but the address I had didn't lead anywhere. I always wondered what happened to that little boy in the picture." David was quiet for a moment, trying to piece together the timeline in his head. "My dad would have been about 8 when my grandfather died. He grew up with his mother, my grandmother. She raised him by herself." "And your father now?" David's expression darkened a little. "He left when I was 12. Mom says he had trouble holding down jobs, keeping things together. I haven't seen him in 5 years." Blackstone looked pained by this information. Samuel would have been heartbroken to know that his son struggled like that. He had such high hopes for his family's future. "My grandmother still lives with us," David continued. "She's the one who gave me this necklace on my 16th birthday. She said my grandfather would have wanted me to have something to remember him by." "Your grandmother," Blackstone said with sudden interest. "She knew Samuel?" "She was married to my grandfather's son, so she would have been Samuel's daughter-in-law. But she never really talks about those days much. She just says my grandfather was a good man who died serving his country." Blackstone was quiet for a long moment, lost in thought. David could see that the man was processing a lot of emotions and memories. "You know," Blackstone said eventually, "you have his hands." "What do you mean?" David barely slept that night. He kept turning Blackstone's business card over in his hands, reading the name and phone number again and again. The whole situation felt like something out of a movie, not something that could happen to a regular kid from his neighborhood. When morning came, David found himself sitting at the small kitchen table in his family's apartment, staring at the card while his grandmother made breakfast. His mother had already left for her first job at the hospital, where she worked as a cleaning lady from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. "You're awfully quiet this morning," his grandmother said, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "Something on your mind?" David looked up at the woman who had helped raise him. Betty Williams was in her 70s now, with gray hair and gentle hands that showed the wear of decades of hard work. She had been taking care of people her whole life, first her own children, then her grandchildren, and now she spent her days looking after elderly neighbors who needed help with shopping and cooking. "Grandma," David said carefully, "tell me about my grandfather, the one who died in the war." Betty's hand paused as she was pouring coffee. She looked at David with surprise. "Samuel? Why are you asking about him all of a sudden?" "I met someone yesterday who knew him, someone who was there when he died." Betty sat down heavily in the chair across from David. Her face had gone pale, and she was gripping her coffee cup with both hands. "Who did you meet?" David pulled out Blackstone's business card and showed it to her. "This man came to the shop where I work. His name is Jonathan Blackstone. He said he and my grandfather were friends in the military." Betty stared at the card for a long time without saying anything. David could see that her hands were starting to shake a little, just like Blackstone's had the day before. "Jonathan," she whispered finally, "after all these years." "You know him?" David asked, surprised. "I know of him," Betty said. "Samuel wrote letters home during the war. He mentioned Jonathan many times. They were very close friends." David leaned forward eagerly. "What did he say about him?" Betty got up and walked to an old wooden chest that sat in the corner of the living room. David had seen her go through that chest many times over the years, but she had never explained what was inside. She came back carrying a small metal box that looked like it had once held cookies or candy. "I saved all of Samuel's letters," she said, opening the box carefully. "I thought maybe someday your father would want to read them, but he never showed any interest." Inside the box were dozens of envelopes, all addressed in careful handwriting. There were also some photographs, military documents, and other papers that looked old and fragile. Betty picked up one of the letters and handed it to David. "This one talks about Jonathan. Samuel wrote it about 6 months before he died." David unfolded the letter carefully. The paper was yellowed with age and the ink had faded, but he could still read his grandfather's handwriting. "My dear family, I hope this letter finds you all in good health. The missions have been dangerous lately, but I have a good friend watching my back. His name is Jonathan Blackstone, and I trust him with my life. He's smart and brave, and he reminds me a lot of what I hope my son will grow up to be. Jonathan and I made a pact that if anything happens to one of us, the other, we'll make sure our families are taken care of. I pray that neither of us will need to honor that promise, but it gives me comfort to know that someone will be there for you if I don't make it home." David felt his throat getting tight as he read his grandfather's words. Here was proof that Blackstone had been telling the truth about their friendship and their promise. "There are more letters that mention Jonathan," Betty said softly. "Samuel wrote about their flying missions together, about how Jonathan saved his life during one particularly dangerous flight. He also wrote about their plans for after the war." "What kind of plans?" Betty pulled out another letter. "Samuel wanted to start a small aviation business. He was going to teach flying lessons and maybe do some cargo runs. He wrote that Jonathan was going to help him get started, maybe invest some money in the business." David's mind was racing. So they had it all planned out? "Samuel had big dreams," Betty said with a sad smile. "He was going to teach your father to fly as soon as he was old enough. He wanted the family to be involved in aviation together." "What happened after he died? Why didn't Jonathan help the family like he promised?" Betty sighed deeply. "The military told us that Samuel's plane went down over enemy territory and that his body was never recovered. We had a memorial service, but there was no funeral, no real closure. A few months later, a man came to the house asking questions about Samuel's family. Jonathan? We assumed so, but he never gave his name. Your grandfather, Samuel's father, was so bitter about losing his son that he wouldn't talk to anyone connected to the military. He told the man to leave and never come back." David felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. "So Jonathan tried to help, but great-grandfather wouldn't let him?" "That's what I think happened. Samuel's father blamed the military for his son's death. He didn't want anything to do with anyone who reminded him of the war. And then what? Life was hard after that. Samuel's father died a few years later, and your father grew up without knowing much about his dad. By the time your father had you, the family had lost touch with anything connected to Samuel's military service." David looked down at the letter, in his hands, feeling the weight of all the missed opportunities and broken connections. "So all these years, Jonathan has been wondering what happened to us, and we've been wondering what happened to him." "It seems that way," Betty agreed. David told his grandmother about meeting Blackstone at the aircraft shop, about how the businessman had recognized the pilot wings, and about the emotional conversation that followed. Betty listened carefully, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. "He wants to help me," David concluded. "He said something about honoring the promise he made to my grandfather." Betty was quiet for a long time, looking through the box of letters and photographs. Finally, she pulled out a picture that David had never seen before. It showed two young, men in military uniforms standing next to a small aircraft. One of them looked like a younger version of Blackstone. "This is Samuel and Jonathan," she said, handing David the photograph. Samuel sent this home shortly before his last mission. David studied the faces in the old photograph. His grandfather looked strong and confident, with the same stubborn chin that David saw in the mirror every morning. Jonathan looked younger and more serious, but there was something in his eyes that reminded David of the businessman he had met the day before. "They look like they were good friends," David observed. "The best," Betty confirmed. Samuel wrote that Jonathan was like a brother to him. David picked up his phone and looked at Blackstone's business card again. "I'm supposed to call him today. Art B. You going to?" David felt nervous just thinking about it. "I don't know what to say. This is all so big, so complicated." Betty reached across the table and took David's hand. "Let me tell you something about your grandfather. Samuel believed that everything happens for a reason. He used to say that the universe has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time. You think this is one of those times?" "I think," Betty said carefully, "that maybe it's time for this family to stop running from opportunities. Your father was so afraid of failing that he never really tried to succeed at anything. But you're different, David. You have Samuel's determination and his gift for understanding how things work." David felt the weight of his grandmother's words. She was right about his father. The man had drifted from job to job, relationship to relationship, never committing to anything long enough to see if it might work out. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should call Jonathan and listen to what he has to say. You don't have to make any decisions right away, but you owe it to yourself and to Samuel's memory to at least hear him out." David nodded slowly. He looked at the clock on the kitchen wall and realized that it was almost 10 in the morning. Blackstone had said to call, but he hadn't specified what time. Taking a deep breath, David dialed the number on the business card. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Jonathan Blackstone." "Mr. Blackstone? This is David Johnson, from the aircraft shop yesterday." "David." Blackstone's voice immediately became warmer. "I was hoping you would call. How are you feeling today?" "Confused mostly," David admitted. "But my grandmother showed me some letters that my grandfather wrote during the war. Letters that mention you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Your grandmother kept Samuel's letters?" "All of them. She also has a photograph of you and my grandfather standing next to a plane." "I remember that picture," Blackstone said softly. "It was taken the day before our last mission together." "Mr. Blackstone, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why didn't you try harder to find us after the war? I mean, I understand that my great-grandfather was difficult, but—" Blackstone was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair question, and I'm not proud of the answer. After Samuel died, I was dealing with my own guilt and grief. When I couldn't locate the family through the military records, I probably should have hired a private investigator or found some other way to keep looking. Instead, I threw myself into building my business, telling myself that success was the best way to honor Samuel's memory." "But you never forgot about the promise?" "Never. Not a single day went by that I didn't think about Samuel and wonder what happened to his family. I built my aerospace company partly as a tribute to him, but I always knew that wasn't enough." David looked at his grandmother, who was listening to his side of the conversation with great interest. "Mr. Blackstone, my grandmother is here with E. Would you like to talk to her?" "Very much." David handed the phone to Betty, who took it with trembling hands. "Jonathan?" she said softly. David could hear Blackstone's voice through the phone, though he couldn't make out the words. He watched his grandmother's face change as she listened, her expression cycling through surprise, sadness, and something that might have been relief. "Yes, I remember that letter," Betty said. "Samuel was so excited about the business plans you two had made." She paused, listening. "He would have been proud of what you've accomplished." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Betty occasionally laughing or wiping away tears. Finally, she handed the phone back to David. "David," Blackstone said, "I'd like to meet with you and your grandmother in person. There are some things I want to show you, Some stories I want to share about your grandfather. Would that be possible? I guess so, David said. When were you thinking? How about this afternoon? I could come to your home, or if you're more comfortable, we could meet somewhere neutral. David looked at his grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. You could come here, David said. If you don't mind a small apartment? I don't mind at all. Samuel always said that home wasn't about the size of the place, it was about the love of the people inside. After David gave Blackstone the address and they agreed on a time, he hung up the phone and looked at his grandmother. This is really happening, isn't it? He said. It seems like it is, Betty replied. Are you ready for your life to change? David touched the pilot wings hanging around his neck. For the first time since putting on the necklace that morning, they felt warm against his skin. I think so, he said. I think grandfather would want me to be ready. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, David heard a gentle knock on the apartment door. He had been pacing around the small living room for the past hour, nervous about what was going to happen. His grandmother had spent the morning cleaning the apartment until it sparkled, even though it was already neat and tidy. When David opened the door, he was surprised to see that Blackstone had come alone. No bodyguards, no fancy cars, just one man carrying a leather briefcase and what looked like a photo album. Hello, David, Blackstone said with a warm smile. Thank you for inviting me to your home. Please, come in, David replied, stepping aside to let the businessman enter. Betty appeared from the kitchen wearing her best dress and looking nervous but determined. Mr. Blackstone, she said formally. Please, call me Jonathan, he replied, extending his hand. It's an honor to finally meet you properly, Mrs. Williams. As they sat down in the small living room, David noticed that Blackstone looked different than he had at the aircraft hangar. Less intimidating, more like a regular person who happened to wear expensive clothes. His eyes kept moving around the room, taking in the family photographs on the walls and the simple but comfortable furniture. This feels like a real home, Blackstone said. Samuel would have loved it here. Would you like some coffee or tea? Betty asked. Coffee would be wonderful. Thank you. While Betty went to the kitchen, Blackstone opened his briefcase and pulled out several manila folders. David, I brought some things I thought you might want to see. Documents and photographs from my time with your grandfather. David moved closer as Blackstone opened the first folder. Inside were military records, mission reports, and more photographs than David had ever seen of his grandfather. Some showed Samuel working on aircraft engines, others showed him with other pilots, and several showed him with Jonathan. Your grandfather was the best mechanic in our squadron, Blackstone explained, pointing to a photo of Samuel with his hands deep inside an aircraft engine. He could diagnose problems that stumped everyone else, just like you did yesterday with my jet. David studied the photograph. His grandfather looked completely focused on his work, the same way David felt when he was solving a mechanical problem. He taught me everything I know about aircraft maintenance, Blackstone continued. Before I met Samuel, I was just a pilot. He showed me that understanding how the machines work makes you a better flyer. Betty returned with coffee and sat down next to David. Jonathan, tell us about Samuel as a person. What was he like today? Blackstone's face lit up with memories. He was the kind of person who made everyone around him better. When new pilots joined our unit, Samuel always took time to help them understand their aircraft. He never made anyone feel stupid for asking questions. That sounds like him, Betty said softly. Even as a young man before the war, he was always helping his neighbors fix their cars or farm equipment. He was funny too, Blackstone added. Samuel could tell stories that would have the whole barracks laughing until we cried. But when it came to flying and maintaining aircraft, he was completely serious. He used to say that attention to detail was the difference between coming home and not coming home. David felt a strange mix of pride and sadness as he learned more about the grandfather he had never really known. What were his plans after the war, besides the aviation business? Blackstone opened another folder and pulled out a handwritten document. He actually wrote out a detailed business plan. Look at this. David took the papers and read his grandfather's careful handwriting. Samuel had planned everything. The type of aircraft he wanted to buy, the services he would offer, even the location where he wanted to set up his business. At the bottom of the last page, there was a note that made David's heart skip a beat. First student pilot, my son. Goal, father, and son flying together by his 16th birthday. He really wanted to teach my dad to fly, David said quietly. More than anything, Blackstone confirmed. Samuel talked about it constantly. He had this vision of building something that could be passed down through the family for generations. Betty wiped her eyes with a tissue. If only things had worked out differently. But maybe they still can, Blackstone said, looking directly at David. That's actually why I wanted to meet with both of you today. David felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? Blackstone set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. David, yesterday at the hangar, I watched you solve a problem that had stumped experienced mechanics. You have your grandfather's gift, his intuitive understanding of how aircraft work. But more than that, you have his character, his determination, his refusal to give up when things get difficult. I just like fixing things, David said modestly. It's more than that, and you know it, Blackstone replied. You have a passion for aviation that comes from somewhere deep inside. I saw it in your eyes yesterday when you were working on my jet. David nodded. He couldn't deny that being around aircraft made him feel more alive and focused than anything else in his life. Here's what I'm proposing, Blackstone continued. I want to honor the promise I made to your grandfather 30 years ago. I want to help you get the education and training that Samuel would have wanted for his family. What kind of education? David asked. Blackstone opened his briefcase again and pulled out several brochures from colleges and flight schools. Aerospace engineering degree, commercial pilot training, aircraft maintenance certification, whatever path interests you most. I'll pay for all of it. David felt like he couldn't breathe properly. You want to pay for me to go to college? Not just college. I want to give you the opportunity to build the kind of life in aviation that your grandfather dreamed about. And I want to do it the right way, so you earn everything you achieve. Betty spoke up. Jonathan, this is incredibly generous, but we can't accept charity. It's not charity, Blackstone said firmly. It's keeping a promise, and it's also good business. How is it good business? David asked. Blackstone smiled. Because I think you're going to be exceptional at whatever you choose to do in aviation. My company can always use talented people who understand both the technical and business sides of aerospace. David looked at the college brochures spread out on the coffee table, schools he had never even dreamed of attending, programs that seemed impossibly expensive for a family like his. I don't know if I'm smart enough for this level of education, David admitted. David, Betty said, putting her hand on his shoulder, you taught yourself aircraft maintenance from library books and internet videos. You solved a problem yesterday that professionals couldn't figure out. Don't ever question whether you're smart enough. Blackstone nodded in agreement. Your grandmother is absolutely right. Intelligence isn't just about grades in school. It's about curiosity, determination, and the ability to see solutions that others miss. You have all of those qualities. David picked up one of the brochures. It showed students working on actual aircraft in modern, well-equipped hangars. What would I have to do? First, you'd need to finish high school, which I understand you're doing well with already. Then you'd start with basic courses while also beginning flight training. The idea is to give you both the theoretical knowledge and the practical experience. And after that? After that, you have choices. You could work for my company, start your own aviation business like your grandfather planned, or do anything else that interests you. The important thing is that you'd have the skills and credentials to succeed in whatever path you choose. David felt overwhelmed by the possibilities. This is all so much to think about. I understand, Blackstone said. Take your time to consider it, but I want you to know that I'm completely serious about this offer. Betty had been quiet for several minutes, but now she spoke up. Jonathan, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why is this so important to you? I mean, I understand about the promise you made to Samuel, but you've built a successful business. You have your own life. Why does it matter so much to help David? Blackstone was quiet for a moment, staring down at his hands. Because for 30 years I've been successful in business, but I've felt like a failure as a friend. I've made millions of dollars, but I never kept the most important promise I ever made. He looked up at David. Yesterday, when I saw those pilot wings around your neck, it was like Samuel was giving me a second chance, an opportunity to finally do what I should have done decades ago. But what if I don't succeed? David asked. What if I'm not as good as you think I am? Then you'll try again. Blackstone replied simply. That's what your grandfather would have done. Samuel failed at things sometimes, but he never let failure stop him from trying. David looked at his grandmother, who was watching him with encouraging eyes. What do you think, Grandma? I think, Betty said slowly, that Samuel sent Jonathan back into our lives for a reason. I think your grandfather would want you to take this chance. David took a deep breath. Okay, I want to try. Blackstone's face broke into a huge smile. Really? Really. But I have some conditions. Name them. First, I want to keep working at Mr. Henderson's shop while I'm in school. I don't want to lose touch with hands-on aircraft work. Absolutely. Practical experience is just as important as classroom learning. Second, I want my grandmother to be involved in all the decisions. She's been taking care of this family for a long time, and I'm not making any major choices without her input. Betty squeezed David's hand, her eyes filling with tears of pride. Agreed, Blackstone said. And third, I want to learn everything I can about my grandfather, his military service, his dreams, his plans for the future. If I'm going to carry on his legacy, I want to understand what that really means. I think that's the most important condition of all, Blackstone replied. Samuel's legacy isn't just about aviation. It's about integrity, hard work, and never giving up on your dreams. Over the next 2 hours, they discussed the practical details of David's education. Blackstone had already researched several programs and had contacts at aviation schools around the country. They decided to start with a community college program that would allow David to get his basic education while also beginning flight training. There's one more thing, Blackstone said as the afternoon was ending. I want to establish a scholarship program in your grandfather's name, the Samuel Williams Aviation Scholarship, for young people from working families who want to pursue careers in aerospace. David felt a lump in his throat. You'd really do that? Samuel believed that opportunity should be available to everyone who's willing to work for it. This seems like the right way to honor that belief. As Blackstone prepared to leave, he handed David a small wrapped package. This is something I've been carrying around for 30 years, hoping someday I'd be able to give it to Samuel's family. David unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a compass, old but well-maintained, with an inscription on the back. To Jonathan, may you always find your way home. S.W. Samuel gave this to me before our last mission, Blackstone explained. He said it would help me navigate back to the things that really mattered. I want you to have it now. David held the compass in his palm, feeling its weight. Thank you. For everything. Thank your grandfather, Blackstone replied. He's the one who made all of this possible. 6 months later, David stood on the tarmac of a small airport, wearing a flight suit and preparing for his first solo flight as a student pilot. The training had been challenging, but he had excelled beyond everyone's expectations. His natural understanding of aircraft systems combined with formal education had made him one of the top students in his class. Betty stood nearby, watching with pride as David completed his pre-flight inspection. Blackstone was there too, having driven down from the city to witness this milestone. He looks just like Samuel did before his first solo flight, Blackstone said quietly. Samuel would be so proud, Betty replied. David walked over to them before, climbing into the small training aircraft. Around his neck, as always, he wore his grandfather's pilot wings. But now he also wore a student pilot pin that he had earned through his own hard work and determination. I'm ready, he announced. Are you nervous? Betty asked. A little, David admitted. But grandfather's compass says I'm heading in the right direction. He pulled out the compass that Blackstone had given him. The needle pointed steadily north, just as it had for 30 years. "He's with you," Blackstone said. "I can feel it." David climbed into the cockpit and started the engine. As the small plane taxied toward the runway, he thought about all the events that had led to this moment. A broken electrical system, a chance meeting, a necklace that held more history than he had ever imagined. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, David felt the same sense of rightness that he experienced when fixing engines or solving mechanical problems. This was where he belonged in the sky that his grandfather had loved so much. From the ground, Betty and Blackstone watched the plane climb into the blue afternoon sky. "Promise kept," Blackstone said softly. "Promise kept." Betty agreed. And somewhere, in the clouds above them, David Johnson was discovering that dreams could survive for generations, waiting for the right moment to take flight again.